Alright, so we're going to learn the basics of React, and we're going to do a crash course. So we're going to start from the basics and then we'll build some of the functionalities, etc. Okay, so what is React basically? So React is nothing but a JavaScript library, and it is used to build user interfaces. It has some of the features that it offers, like it's component based. So rather than writing like 1,000 lines of code, you can break your code into pieces, into small components, and then you can use it at multiple places. For example, if it's a blog post card, that card may be used at different pages. You can create one component and then use it almost everywhere. Okay. Also, you can use React at different places, so that's why it talks about learn once and write anywhere. So it doesn't matter about what. So you can see that it says that it doesn't make assumptions about the rest of the technology stack you're using. You can use React. You can even, if you have any piece of code that you want to convert it into React, you can rewrite your existing code as well. Okay, and then you can also power the mobile apps when you learn the React Native. Okay, so tomorrow if you're building mobile apps, that will be useful for you. This is how a simple component looks like in React. So basically this is returning the JSX, which I will explain in a moment. And JSX is optional, it's not really required, but you will see in a moment what is the benefit of using JSX. And here it is just basically rendering that component and then inserting the content of that inside of a div tag, a div with an ID of hello example. Okay, so I'm not going to go over all of this. We'll directly start with basics. So we'll start with the hello world. So this is the smallest React example that we are looking at. You can check this out in CodePen. So if you go over here and if you open it up, you can see that it says hello world. If you inspect element, you can see that you have your entire HTML, and inside of that you have a div with an ID of root, and all we are doing is injecting our React content inside of that div with an ID of root, and that's what we're doing over here. So using React DOM.render and then inserting our this particular markup and then inserting inside of the div with an ID of root. Also, if you take a look at CSS over here, if you take a look at HTML, you have this div with an ID of root, so that's what we saw. And then if you take a look at CSS, there's nothing inside of CSS. If you take a look at JavaScript, so you can see that it has included this React DOM.development.js and React.development.js. So it has included these packages for React to function. And in the CSS we don't have anything, so you need to include those if you are going with like normal including the packages. Okay, now let's continue. The best place to learn React would be its documentation, and that's what we will be going through in this project. So I'll be taking the help of the documentation to explain different concepts to you, and I'm going to keep it short. If you want details, you can read all of this, but here is your main place where we're going to learn different things over here. Okay, so that's the first one, says hello world, then it talks about JSX. Okay, so JSX is nothing but JavaScript plus XML, and it's kind of allows you to write JavaScript inside HTML. Okay, so you can see this funny tag. This is funny tag syntax is neither a string nor HTML. It's called JSX, and it's a syntax extension to JavaScript. Okay, and JSX produces your React elements. Okay, and why we are using JSX is sometimes you will notice that when you're writing React, so now if you're taking a look at this example, you can see that if we create a constant called name and there's an element called hello name, it basically going to replace this value over here directly rather than doing concatenation of hello plus name and plus h1 and stuff. Okay, so just makes your job easier. Again, I won't be going into detail of this right now, but you can check it out. Yeah, and you can also call functions inside of this. So you can see that you're calling function, you can pass objects inside of this, and you can also write HTML. So you can write HTML and JavaScript together. So now we'll go to rendering elements. So in React, the element describe what you want to see on the screen. So unlike browser elements, React elements are plain object and are cheap to create. So this is a element, okay, that will in this case is a h1 tag with some text inside of it. And React DOM takes care of updating the DOM to match the React element. Okay, now how do we render the React element? In order for us to render the React element, all we're going to do is call the function react dom.render, and then we pass our element, in this case h1 with hello world inside of it, and then we inject it inside of the div with an ID of root. So I already gave this example earlier, if you remember, in the code pen, where we had this div with an ID of root, and then we went ahead and injected our hello world inside of it. So that's how I just shown you a while back, right? This is the one. So that's what this function is doing. This function react dom.render is basically taking a React element and inserting it inside of the div with an ID of root. Okay, so that's why when you inspect element, you see that div with an ID of root, and this is your React element. So this is the function responsible for injecting this h1 inside of this div. All right, so let's close that. Now, one of the benefits of using React is that it only updates what's necessary. So let's say you have an entire component, it compares what has changed and it goes ahead and updates only that stuff. So take a look at this example. This is your entire component, like hello world and all of these stuff. If you go ahead and create a function, for example, at this time, say new date, and then to local time to string, and then you do a set interval. So what this is going to do is going to run this tick function every 1 second, which means every 1 second you're going to get the new date, new time. Okay, so that's why you see that every 1 second this is being called and this is being updated. Now if you notice, the whole section, the whole thing is not getting updated. It's only updating that particular part. So that's a benefit of React. It only updates what's necessary, and that's why most people use it, right? So it compares the element and its children to the previous one and only applies the DOM updates necessary to bring the DOM to the desired state. So DOM is the document object model, which is this one. Okay, right. So that's that. Then we'll talk about components and props. So components let you split the UI into independent reusable pieces and think about each piece in isolation. So I was already explained in the beginning that rather than writing 1,000 lines of code, you can break them into pieces, and then you can reuse the code as well. And then you can really focus on that small part rather than focusing on the big chunk of code, which will be even difficult to debug. Okay, so that is the meaning of component basically. All right, and so conceptually, components are like JavaScript functions, right? They accept arbitrary inputs called props. So you can pass props inside of these functions, and then you can use those props as well. Okay, there are two types of components. One is functional components and second is class components. We have been using class in the past, but now since the time React hooks were introduced, then it's mostly that we are using functional components rather than class-based components. But just to let you know, class-based components do exist. It's best to use the functional component rather than the class-based components. Okay, so that's your component basically. And so take a look at this example. We create a component And like I said, component is in this case a function. You name it as whatever name you want to give. Let's say welcome. It takes some props. You can pass the prop inside of it. Then you return the value inside of it, which is this. And then you create your React element. You set its value equal to this component. So this is how these are your named components, by the way. Okay, so you can see that that's the name I've given. Then you can pass the props. In this case, I'm passing name equals Sarah. So now inside of props, whatever you pass here, like name equals Sarah, will be available over here. So you can access the name by saying props.name. So now if we go ahead, so what it's going to do is basically it's going to call this function, is going to return this h1, and is going to replace this value props.name with what's been passed here, Sarah. So this will be hello Sarah. And then as already explained to you, that React DOM.render is going to take the React element and inject it inside of the div with an ID of root. So if you take a look in the code pen, so we already discussed that you have the HTML and you have the div with an ID of root. What this function is going to do is React DOM.render is going to take that element. So what is the element? Element equals this functional component. So this is the component. This component is going to return h1. Hello is going to get props. So props is passed to this component, and it's going to say props.name. It's going to get this value. So it's going to replace this props.name with this Sarah, and then it's going to go ahead and inject this whole h1 inside of this root. So now if you go back and check, so I hope you're clear so far. So if you now go and check, it has injected the h1, and notice that it's replaced that props.name. This was props.name, right? So what was the name? Name was Sarah. So it went ahead and replaced that. So see, it replaced that to Sarah. Okay, so that's how you can pass values to your components, the props. These are called props. Okay, so this is just a recap of what we discussed. We call React DOM.render with the welcome component element, and React calls the welcome component with name Sarah as props. Welcome component returns h1 hello Sarah element as result, and then it efficiently updates the DOM to match h1 Sarah. Okay. One thing important to note is that always start your component names with a capital letter. So as you can see that when we created this component, we created with the capital letter. That's how it knows that it's your custom component. Otherwise, these can be your small letters, which are your tags, but these need to be starting with the capital letters. Just make sure you do that, otherwise you will get an error. Okay, so the welcome component represents the components and requires welcome to be in scope. All right. Now, how do we compose these components? You can see that the same component can be used multiple times as well. Right? Let's say we create another component called app. Okay. This is another component. So we're creating two components. One component is welcome and second component is app. Yeah. So remember when we talked about over here, conceptually, components are like JavaScript functions. So treat them like a function. So coming back to this one. So here you say that we're creating two components. One is welcome and second is app. So let's focus this on one by one. What does it return? So we already had an example on top where it's returning hello. It accepts props, and it's expecting that props will have something called name, and it's going to replace that. It accepts props. Now inside of props you can pass anything. You can pass name, you can pass age, whatever. And then you can access these values with dot, because it's this is called, these are props. These are props. Okay, so a component can pass a prop like this, and that component will accept the prop. So this is accepting the prop. I could have written this as age equals 14, and then I have to access props.age. I can pass multiple also. I can do name and then I can do age also. Age equals 12. So I can do props.name and I can do props.age. and that way I can have both. So you can pass multiple props, single props, you can pass as many props as you want. Okay, so what is happening here in this second component? So the second one is this your function, and sorry, this is also a component. Okay, and this is returning a div. What this is doing is one component can return another component as well, and the same component can be used multiple times. So this is returning the same component 3 times, 1, 2, 3. But the difference is each time it's returning a different, each time it's passing a different value for the prop. The first time it's passing this, second time it's passing this, and third time it's passing this. So what do you expect would happen? So what would happen is it is going to print h1 3 times. So this will get replaced by what this is returning. So h1. Second time, first time the name will be Sarah, second time the name will be Kahel, third time will be Eriti. And over here, same thing, you already know that if you would like React to go ahead and update the DOM with your component, React element, then you need to use this function called React DOM.render. So this function accepts 2 parameters. First is your React element, so in this case is our app, and then second is where you want to inject it. So that's how you write a component name. Okay, so take a look at all the examples. You could have written it like const equals app and then directly use app over here, or you could directly use it like this. So if you notice over here, see what we've done here. We stored this value in element, that's why you're passing this as element. But we could have very well just copied this and pasted it here as well. Okay, so it's just storing it in a variable and just passing it. So whatever your element is, in this case is the app. So that's how you write the components. Can you see? That's the syntax to write the component. Okay, so in this case we are not storing it into a variable or a constant, hence we are directly using it like this. So this is how to use the component basically. This is how you define it because it's a function, and this is how you use it. So it's the name, and then if it has a prop, pass it. If it doesn't, no problem. And then the closing tag. So as you can see that this is also a component, so we are using it. We are not passing any props because it doesn't ideally accept any props. You can, so it's optional. Whether you want to send a prop or you don't want to send a prop, it's your choice. So this component is not accepting any props, so I'm not passing any. But this component requires some props, so we are passing it. So it's optional. So take a look at in CodePen. So same thing goes here as well. So you've got div with an ID of root. And then if you notice, and then same piece of code. So see what's happening here. It's taking app and it's injecting into the div with an ID of root. So what is app returning? App is returning this component 3 times, but every time the value will be different. That's why the first time is replacing it with Sarah, second time is replacing it with Kahal, and third time with edit. Now if you do an inspect element, I would expect h1 to be injected 3 times. So can you see it's injected 3 times? Each time the value is different. And there's also a wrapper div, because you see this is the wrapper div, right? So just compare what's happening here. So you've got, it's injecting in the div with the ID of root, and then it's taking this div as a wrapper div, then it's replacing welcome component with what this component is returning. So this is returning h1, and it's saying hello, and then it's saying props.name. So what's the props.name? It's Sarah here, so it's putting that there. And then it goes to the next one, which is this. It says hello because that's what it says, and then it's passing the name Kahal over here. So I hope you're able to understand what's happening here. Yeah, cool. That's the simplest example. So you're good with that. Then we're going to do with state and lifecycle. Okay, so what is state and what is the life cycle of a component? So consider the ticking clock example from the previous section where we discussed about that ticking clock where the time was running, right? So in rendering elements, we have only learned one way to update the UI. We did like a set interval which was getting called every seconds, and then every second is was updating the time, like in this one. So if you remember, this is our function. We have the element. We're calling JavaScript function date.toLocal time strings, going to return the time string, and then we are passing this element that we have and injecting inside of root. And then we're calling this function tick every 1 second. So every 1 second React DOM.render will be called, and it's going to insert the new updated time inside of the div with an ID of root. So this was one way of doing it. But so let me refresh your memory. See what's happening here. See, this time is getting updated, right? See, this is the element. What is it inside of element? Element, you have div. So you have div here. Sorry, this one. You have h1. You have h1 here. You have h2. Inside of h2, I am calling a function called date.toLocal time string, which is going to return the current time. Then we are using React DOM.render, which is going to take this element, which means the whole stuff from div to this one, and it's going to inject it over here. So it's going to update the DOM with that information. What React is doing is React is not updating any other thing, because it compares the previous copy of the virtual DOM with the new copy. Okay, so it basically creates two copies of the DOM, and it calls it a virtual DOM. So it compares what changed from previous to new, what changed. If there's a change, only then it goes and update. If it doesn't change, then it doesn't update. So in this case, every time it's calling, every time it's injecting it, it's checking what was the previous copy. So previous copy was like 2016-16, but this time, because it changed to the new time, it's only updating that part. It's not even updating anything else. So that part is getting updated. So that's the beauty of React. It's only going to update that part of that component. All right. So that was one way of doing it. So in this case, we made it a little better. We encapsulated this inside of a clock function, and then all we're doing is we're directly passing this component. Why did we pass the component and not the constant? So in the previous example, we passed the element, right? Because we stored it inside of it. But this time, what we did is we wrapped this inside of a component. So notice what's happening here. So we created a component, which is basically a function, and we're just returning from that. Rather than saying const element equals this, we are wrapping this inside a function, just returning outside from that. This is more simpler, you know. All this is wanting to know what element do you want to inject inside of the div with an ID of root. Okay, so you wrap it inside of a function, it's up to you. Okay, and remember we spoke about that in the previous version. It didn't have any props, but this one does. So it has a prop called date, and you know that you can access this value by props.date. So you can see that it says props.date. What will it get? It will get this value, new date. So it's going to replace props.date with a new date, and then .toLocal time string. So it's the same thing. If you notice, it's the same thing, right? New date .toLocal time string. Earlier we were directly writing it, but now we are passing this as props and then replacing that with that. So see new date. So we're passing it from here, from that component, and then it's going to use that. So same thing. Whether you write new date .toLocal time string like what we have done here, or you pass that as a prop. So because its value is available inside date, it's just going to replace that programmatically. Okay, and if you take a look at this code pen example, it's going to do exactly the same. There is no difference whatsoever. It will still output the same value. Okay. All right. Now there's another version of it. What this is saying is that rather than we passing this value as props, let clock component, which is this component, handle this on its own. So what we want to do is that write this once and let clock update itself. Okay, so how do we do that? So for rather than passing this as props every time, we want clock to handle this part itself, so that we don't have to pass this as a prop. So how do we do that is we are going to introduce something called state. Okay, so we need to add state to the clock component. What is its current state? Okay, so state is similar to props, but it is private and fully controlled by the component. Props can be passed from one component to another, but state is something that is inside of that component. It's private to that component only. It's not available outside. Okay, so now we'll talk about class-based components. So we learned about functional-based components. There are two types of components, functional-based and class-based. Okay, we won't be covering in depth about what class-based components are because we won't really be using it, but as a React developer, you should know what are class-based components because sometimes you might see them. So first, the very first thing I'm going to do is, you know that we have created a functional component clock. We'll just convert this component into a class-based component. So how do we do that? All we have to do is, rather than writing function clock, we'll write class clock, and then we're going to use the keyword extends the react.component class. So React has a class called component, and what we're doing is we are using our custom component and we are extending React's component. So that's the syntax of writing that way. And then if we were writing functional component, we can directly return it, but if we are using class-based component, then we have to use the method called render. Okay, yeah, and if you're using class-based component, then you have to use the keyword called this. Okay, so where you were writing props.date, now you have to write this.props.date. So this is telling you the difference between if you are using class-based component, then you have to replace this with this. Okay, and instead of just returning, you have to wrap it inside of a render function. So now if we go back, this is how it looks like. Now to define state, we create a function inside of this clock class-based component called constructor. Inside of constructor, we call a function called super and we pass the props inside of it. And then we create a variable called this.state. So this is your state, and we set its value equals an object which has key value pair, which is the key is date and the value is new date. Okay, and then it's returning your whatever it was returning before, so we haven't changed anything here. Yeah, but this time it's saying this.state.date. So if you notice earlier this was this.props.date, but this time we are storing the value of date inside of state. So that's why it's saying this.state.date. Okay, I'm going to go fast on this because, like I said, I won't be really focusing too much on the class-based component because we won't really be using it. But this is just to give you an overview about the class-based component. You don't really have to worry too much about it. If you want in-depth information, you can read later about it. So this is your this is how we pass the props to the constructor. Then we remove the date prop from the clock element, okay, because we don't need to pass like that. And then inside of this we have your state. You're using this. Let's go back. Now we can add some lifecycle methods to the class, and inside of the lifecycle methods we want to set up a timer that whenever clock is rendered to the DOM for the first time, this state is called mounting in React. So when did the component mount? When I say mount means when did the component came into existence, like got rendered the first time. Unmounting means that when was it removed, when was the component left the DOM. So you want to clear the timer whenever the DOM produced by the clock is removed. This is called unmounting. Okay, so there are different life cycle in the component. One is mounting, second is unmounting. Mounting is when it came into the DOM, when it was rendered to the DOM for the first time, and second one, it was removed from the DOM. DOM is basically a document object model. This everything you see over here, this is your DOM. You know, when you do a page source for any page, this is your DOM. The DOM has different elements, your div, your image tag, your link tag, whatever the user sees there. Okay, so what we do is we create component did mount function and component will unmount function. So we create these two functions. Then this inside of this function, rather than doing a set interval at the end where we were doing it here, like where did it go? You're calling it at the end, right? And then every time is what inserting it. Rather than doing that, we're going to call that function inside of this component did mount. Where did it go? Yeah, this one. So we're saying this dot timer ID equals set interval, and then we are passing a function called this dot tick, and we are saying call this function every 1 second. So as soon as that component, which is clock, the moment it's rendered to the DOM, then is going to call this set interval, which means this set interval will keep getting called every 1 second, which means the clock is ticking. In the component will unmount, I want to clear this interval also, which means let's say user goes on a different page or something, we want that component to be removed, right? We don't want that timer to stay there. So that's why we have to when it's removed, so this function gets called when the component is unmounted. So at that time I want to clear the interval. I don't want to make this function keep getting called every time, because we don't need that. So that's why we clear it. Okay, so I'm going to go over it once again with you. What's going to happen is that when the react dom.render is going to get called, so it's going to take this component, is going to call this function constructor, is going to initialize the state of that. So state value will be date equals whatever the value of that date is at that particular time, and then is going to inject this, and then it's going to of course call the render method, and is going to return this value, and that this part is going to get injected inside of this div with an ID of root. So this is how it gets injected. We have established that anytime the component is mounted, which means it comes into the DOM for the first time, it's rendered to the DOM for the first time, this function will be called component did mount. When this function is called, it's going to call set interval. Set interval is going to call tick. Tick is going to call set state. And the basic understanding of the set state is that every time a set state is called, render function is called. Okay, so set state is going to set the new value of the date, which will be whatever that date or the time is at that particular time. And then because the render method will be called, the new value of the date would have changed in the state. So it will be the new time. Okay, and then it's going to re-render this. So the moment it re-renders, React is going to go and check what has changed. Is this div changed? Is this h1 changed? So it's going to find that no, this h1 did not change, this div did not change. All it was changed is the content inside of this h2. So it's going to go ahead and update that. And this whole process is going to happen every 1 second. Why? Because we have put a set interval. We are saying that call this function every 1 second. So the moment the whole component comes into the DOM the very first time, this is going to like kind of a trigger that. It's kind of starting your vehicle, giving it a kickstart, because when you start your vehicle, it runs automatically, right, until you stop it. So it's like kicking start your vehicle. So it's going to kickstart and it's going to keep running. The difference is here is doing something every 1 second. Okay, so maybe think about that vehicle is moving forward every 1 second. Okay, so same way. So it's going to keep updating whatever the new value of the date. So think in a vehicle way. If the vehicle or a scooter or a car is moving, the kilometer is constantly increasing, right? So it's keep updating the kilometer. So think of in those terms. It's going to keep updating the date in this case. Because every time set state is called, render method will be called again. Render method is going to re-render the whole component, and the moment the whole component gets re-rendered, React is going to check what has changed. Whatever part has changed, we're just going to update that part in the DOM. Okay, so that's the basic of state. And there are three things you should know about the set state. First is do not modify the state directly. Don't write like this dot state dot comment equals hello. If you want to modify the state, you have to use the set state function. Okay, that's important to know. State updates may be asynchronous. which means imagine that in this situation you only had updated the time, but maybe you have to update the name of someone or kilometer or whatever else. You can update multiple, you can call this set state multiple times and update multiple values. In that case, if you're calling this multiple time, React is not going to call them one by one. It might batch them together for performance optimization. It's going to batch them together and call them, all at once. That's why it may take some time for that functionality to get complete. So that's why it is asynchronous. Okay. So it says React may batch multiple set state call into a single update for performance. Because this dot props and this dot state may be updated asynchronously, you should not rely on their values to calculate the next state. So in case if you want to do something, let's say you want to show something on the screen once the time has changed to X value. So that means you're relying on the state value. Like when it becomes 9 o'clock, then maybe, or let's give me an example of a new year. Let's say the clock is ticking. Okay, you are working with React and your clock is ticking. You have created a countdown which is supposed to finish at 12. And what you want to do is, automate this process, which means what you want is the moment the clock goes 12, you want to show a component over here or content over here that say Happy New Year. So what you're going to do in that case is that it's the same clock you will create, but it accepts a function rather than object. You can see over here. The function will receive the previous state as the first argument, and the props at the time it updates is applied in the second argument. So inside of that back function, you're going to get the previous state and next state where you can check it, and then accordingly you can update it. So like this. So you can see it's returning the state dot counter and increment or whatever. Okay. Yeah. Data flows down. Neither parent or child component can know if certain component is stateless or stateful or stateless. They shouldn't care what is defined as a function or a class. So the data can be passed to multiple child components. Like for example, let me show you. Like for example, this component. This is a parent component and you have child components, right? So you can pass props from here, and then same props you can pass it to their child components as well. So data flows downwards, not from child to parent, but from parent to child. That's what it's talking about. So the data is commonly called top-down or unidirectional. Any state always owned by the sum component, any data or UI retrieved from that state can only affect the components below in the tree. Cool. So that's that. So I think in terms of the basics, this is good enough. We are going to come back to other stuff. However, now it's time that we do a bit of coding, right? So what we're going to do is setup tutorial, local development, this optional setup. Yep, this is the one. So how are you going to do it? Okay, so there are two ways to have React. First is either you include that package into the script that I showed you in the first example, or you install the React package. If you had to do it manually and set up everything, it is a bit time consuming. So what React has done, in fact React is created by Facebook. So what Facebook has done is that they have created a CLI for you, and it's called Create React App, which is this one. Okay, so this CLI will allow you to create a React application. So how do we do it? All I have to do is just run npx. So npx will allow you to directly use the CLI from the library itself live. You don't really need to install the Create React App CLI. That's by using npx instead of npm. So we'll say Create React App. So is going to stay the same. You can't change this to something else. You have to keep this the same. But you can change the name of your application to something else. So what do you want to name your app as, React app as? Should we name it as my first app? Yeah, let's do that. So the moment you hit it, it's asking you that it needs to install all of these packages. If you proceed yes, you do Y here, and then you can see that it's creating a new React app inside of my folder, which is imranhsayed project slash my first app. So this is where it's creating. It's installing all of the required packages. So what is it installing? It's even telling you that. So you can see that it's installing React, React DOM, React scripts, and with CRA template. So this is what is installing right now from the npm library. It's resolving all of the packages and install all of that. You can see that it's installed these packages and everything is done. You can see that it says success. So it's created my first app at this URL, sorry, at this folder. It has given you a few commands that you can use to start your application, because by just having that code it's not going to work. You need a development server on which it's going to run. Okay, so to start your application, you can see that we suggest that you begin by typing cd my first app yarn start. So let's go ahead and do that. So it's saying go to cd, so cd my first app. I'm doing that. Okay, and before I hit the yarn start, I want to show you what it has done. So I'm going to open the project. I'm going to say projects, and then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to select the my first app and just open it up. So see what it has done. It has created package.json. So this is basically a file which will contain information about what are the packages that installed. So it's installed the testing library, it's React, React DOM, React scripts, Web Vital. I think this is for performance and stuff, checking performance. Then these are the scripts you can run to start your application, to build your application, to test, to run the test. Then it has information about the browser list and stuff, development. So these are a bunch of stuff you don't have to worry about, but just letting you know that what it means. This is the name of your application it's putting over there. So you don't have to touch all of this. Ideally, you should not touch all of this. Okay, you should leave it as it is for now. It has some readme.md. This has information, about what it does, what are the commands that are available, so you can read about it. You have a yarn.log file, so ignore this as well. You have a git ignore. So if you're pushing this package to GitHub, this is going to ignore these files because you don't want to send the node module and stuff. Yeah. So close that as well. Then it's created a source directory. Inside of that, you have your. Okay, before even I go to source directory, take a look at this public. So inside public, you have index.html. This looks familiar to you, right? It's a normal HTML. You have the link tag, meta, all of that look basic stuff. And then you've got, this is familiar to what we have been discussing. So you have a div with an ID of root. So what's going to happen is if you take a look at the source folder and if you go to app.js, see this is a familiar component, right? We created an app component earlier and it's returning a bunch of stuff like HTML, which is basically the JSX in this case. And then it's exporting this component here. And then if you go back to index.js, see it's calling the same function we spoke about, right, which is react dom.render, right? And then it's passing the app, and then it's going to say document.getElement, right? So it's going to inject our app inside of the div with an ID of root, right? So don't worry about all of this, we'll come back to that, but this is just the basic of what it's doing, and it's not any different than what we actually did earlier. Okay, so now if we do npm, so what is it saying? Do yarn start. So yarn start. So it's starting the script, and now on the local host 3000 it started a development server where you'll be able to see the app, and you can see that it's got app.js save to load. So basically all the content. So what is it returning? It's returning everything that's from your app component. So you can see app component says learn React, so that's what we have here. Learn React. It says edit, so it has edit over here. There is a logo image, so that's a logo. We don't necessarily need to use all of this, but if you had to use it, that's how we'll do it. So I'm just going to get rid of all of this stuff here, and I'll just say hello world. And now if you check, you can see all it says hello world, right? Now we can create different components, right? So what you can do is, this is your area where you need to work basically, so ignore this public for now. We'll create a directory called components. Okay, so we have learned how to create component. Let's say I want to create a component called footer. Okay, so I'm going to create a component file, JavaScript file called footer.js. So how do you create a component? We have discussed you can use function and then say footer, and then it needs to return something. So you can return like this, and then inside of this you can write this is my footer. Okay, and then anytime you create a function that you want to use in a different file, you need to export it. So that's your ES according to ES6. Okay, so export. So we can export a default. So if you only have one function you want to export, or one component that you want to export, you will say default. If you have multiple, then you will say export const. But here it's just one function we are exporting. So we'll use export default footer. Okay. Now if you want to use this component, I'll come back, and remember we spoke about that you can put another component inside of one component. So this is your app component, and I can put another component here. So I can say, so how do you write components? We have discussed. You'll say, you'll open brackets and then say footer, and then closing angle brackets. Okay, that's it. And now you also need to import it. So where does it exist? So you need to do import name of the component from, and the path for that. So path is root, so that's why you put dot, then components, the current components, and then footer. Wherever you want to use it. So I want to use this component inside of the app component. So wherever you want to use this component, you need to import it in that on top of the file. Okay, so we are importing it here. It's just like if you want to include a JavaScript file, you have to import it. Similarly, you have to import this component like this. So import name of the component from the path of that file. So path of that file is this. So components and footer. Why I'm putting dot over here? Because both the app.js and this is in the same root. That's why I'm not putting source over here, because both are into the same directory. That's why I'm putting dot. Okay, I'm going to get rid of this header. Okay, I'm going to say, just say hello world. Now you can see this is my footer. You see that? Right? If I remove this component, you can see it's gone. Right? So you can have multiple components. Now you can create a header component also. I can create another component inside of components called header.js, and same thing for this also. So you'll say function header. It needs to return something. Make sure it returns something, otherwise you'll get an error. So you'll say div, this is my header, and you have make sure you have to export it. So export default header, and then you go back to the app.js, which is this file, and then you just include that header. I'm going to remove the hello world. I'm going to use that header component. So my PHP Storm is already pulling it automatically, but if it doesn't do it for your editor, you just need to import it like so. So I imported both header and footer. Let me put this on top instead. Doesn't matter the sequence, but just looks good in the same sequence. Okay, so you got header and footer. You go back, you say this is my header, this is my footer. If you do an inspect element and see what you get. So what do you expect to see? Ideally, what I'm saying is that go ahead and inject the app in the div with an ID of root. What is my app? So my app function, sorry, my app component is this div with a class name of app. So you can see that. So it's taken this div, whole div, and injected inside of root. The same concept we learned, right? So it's injected the header. So this is our header, and injected the footer. So this is our footer. What is the header returning? The header is returning this div. This is my header, so that's why it's here. What is footer returning? So its footer is here, so it's going to replace the content of that. It's basically calling this function over here, and whatever that function is returning, it's going to inject that there. So this footer. The best part is that unlike PHP, we had to go and refresh every time. Here you don't have to refresh. So let's say if I change it to awesome footer and just save it, notice it automatically changed that. So it's using Webpack behind the scenes, and Webpack development server is constantly watching for any changes you make. So whatever changes you make is going to just render those changes onto the front end and just update that. Okay. So now, I'm going to say counter. Let's go with a simple example of counter. I'll say function counter, because as we discussed that components are basically, you can treat them as a function. Export default counter, and inside of this counter I'm just going to return, because remember that a component needs to return something, otherwise you'll get an error. And this will be like let's say 0 for now. I'm just going to include that counter somewhere here. So counter, now you can see that we have 0 here. Okay, now we'll create state. So we'll say const, we'll use the array, we'll say count, and then second parameter is a function. So count is going to store the state value, and then this is going to be the function. You can name this function whatever you want. Set count. Okay, so this is going to set the value of the count, and you're going to use the use state. So of course you have to import use state from React. So import use state from React. Okay, and you have to set the initial value. So I'm setting the initial value as 0. Sorry, initial state value as 0. So what this means is that use state is a React function, and it's going to initialize the value of this variable called count to 0. So the first time, so remember we spoke about that this is JSX, so you can write HTML plus JavaScript. So if you want to write any variable, you have to put curly braces, and then you have to write the name of the variable. So now if you go back and check it, this still says 0, because that's what the initial value is. If I change the initial value to 1, it's going to change that to 1. Yeah. So what this is doing basically is this is setting the initial value of this variable to whatever you're passing it here. Let's set it to 0. Okay, and then this function, job of this function is to change this value. So anytime you call this function, is going to update the value. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we will create a button. Actually, this needs to go. Let's move this inside of p tag, shall we? And then let's do a button. So make sure it has to be wrapped inside like a parent div or something. Otherwise, it won't work. So like if I was writing like this, it's not going to work. Sorry. It's not going to work like that. It needs to have a parent div or something. Okay, so you can either use something like this, like an so that you don't have the empty div, or you can directly wrap this inside of a div. Whichever you want to do. Let's go with this approach. I'm going to change this to p tag. I'm going to just organize this a bit. And then I say button. I say increment. Okay, so on this button I'm going to add a JavaScript function called onClick, and inside of this onClick I'm going to call this function called setCount. So this is the function that, and as we discussed, the job of this function is to change the value of the count. Now how does it change? How does it know what it needs to change this to? So for that, inside of this function you have to pass the value, the new value. So what do you want to change it to? I want to increment by 1. So how will you increment by 1? So you need to know what is the existing value. So where is the existing value? The existing value is contained within this, right? Because the existing value, that's why it's showing over here, existing value, right? So I'm going to put existing value as count, and I'm going to increment 1. So I will say count plus 1. Okay, so what this is going to do is every time this button is clicked, onClick will be called, onClick function, which is a JavaScript function, and that function will call setCount, and setCount is saying, okay, tell me what do you want me to change this count value to. So I'm saying change the count value, whatever that value at that time, increment that by 1. So because it's an issue with this, you need to call an arrow function, and then inside of the arrow function you need to return this function like so. So this is an arrow function. Okay, so now if you go back and if you click on increment, can you see it's increasing? Right? So what's happening here? If you go back inside of this, refresh. So initial value was 0 because we used the state. So it sets the initial. So remember in the previous example when we initialize the state in the constructor in the class component, right? Functional components are more simpler. There we had to do constructor, then we had to initialize the state, then we had to use component did mount, right? And then inside of component did mount we had to call the set state. There's too much of complexity. Can you see how simple this is, the functional components? So these are hooks basically, your use state, use effect, these are hooks and they make your life simpler. So what it talks about is that you don't need to call a function called constructor and then initialize your state here. You can initialize it like this. We just create an array, first parameter, whatever value, whatever name you want to give to that variable. In the previous example it was date. Here it's count. In the previous example you were using set state to change the value of state, but here we are using set count. Job of set count is to update the value of this state. And remember that we discussed that every time a set state is called, component is re-rendered, right? Here we don't have a render function, we directly have the return. So anytime set count is called, so treat this as set state. Anytime set count is called, because the value of the state is changing, is going to re-render this component. That's why when you click on this button, so call the set count, change the value, increment it by 1, so this becomes 1. Notice what happens here. If I click on it, it's not updating everything, it's only updating that part, which is amazing. And only that's why it's so fast. It's not changing anything on the entire page. Why does it have to? I mean, if I'm only making change to one part, why am I supposed to, refresh the whole thing? Unlike PHP, if you had to update something, you have to refresh the whole page, right? It's not a great experience for user. That's why React is getting so popular. That's why if you notice, if you go to Facebook and if you go ahead and update something like, for example, let's say I hit like. So notice what's happening here. If I click on this, do you see this got liked, but nothing changed anywhere else? So the whole thing that you're seeing on Facebook, this is all built in React. In fact, you can create your own Facebook using React. So the moment I'm hitting like, only that part changed. So the color got changed. And of course, something is happening in the back end. The number of likes changed, but whatever. It didn't really change these images or these text, and only change that part. So that's the beauty of React. So same way here, it's only changing the counts. You see, it's blinking, right? There you go. And you see, it's just going up. What we can also do is, so every time the state value is changed, if you update this, so at this point, the state value is 13. If you click it again, so it's a 13 plus 1, which is 14. So see what happens. It becomes 14, right? We can also have something to decrement. So you can say decrement. All I have to do for this is just say count minus 1. And now, can you see it came? And if I click on it, can you see it's going down, right? And I can increment it. And I can decrement it. And it's so simple, so easy. Because of that, I can do whatever I want. All it cares is what is the current value of the state for that variable. So what is the current value? My value is 7. What am I doing? I'm calling set count. My job is to change the value of the state. What do I want to change it to? I want to increment it. Okay, let's change it to 8. What's the current value now? Current value is 8. What do I want to do now? I want to decrement it. The job of this is to change the state. What do I want to change it to? Whatever that current value is, in this case 8 minus 1. So I decrement it, it becomes 7. Increment it becomes 8. You see how simple this is? You've just created a increment and decrement, and similarly you can do a lot of stuff in React. Okay, cool. I think I'll just take you over a few of the other stuff just to explain what else is going on over here, and then we can wrap up this session. So inside of the app.js, we already discussed what this is doing, and then apart from that, inside of index.js, oops, it's opening the wrong files. Index.js, it's importing React because it's using React DOM over here. That's why it's importing React. It's importing React DOM, and then it's also importing CSS. So if you want to import CSS file, you might have worked on the other WordPress project with WEBPACK, where you want to import the CSS. You can import it like this, right? So you can write your CSS like this, the way you write it. You don't have to worry about anything. You can write your CSS and you can just import it. Then because you are using this app and injecting it inside of div with an ID of root, you're importing app as well. So it's very simple logic. Whenever you create a component, you need to export it so that it can be imported somewhere else. By just creating the component, it's not going to work. If you have to use it, you have to come back to that app and then you need to use it there. Okay, so like in this case, we are using these 3 components, and anytime you want to use that component, you have to import it like so. So when you create it, you have to export it so it can be imported elsewhere, and when you want to use it, you have to import it. Same thing is happening here as well. There are some web vitals and stuff which you can ignore. This is this is for performance and stuff, so you can check this out. Information is not really need to go through too much on that. You can also have logos. You can see this logo. You can create image tags. You can put source inside of it. There was an example for that. There are some test files you can ignore for now. You don't need to worry. Yeah, so I think there's nothing else. I have explained everything over here. In the public, we have some favicon available. So in index.js, you are using some favicon here. You have some logos, robot.txt. So ignore all of that for now. You don't need to worry about all of that stuff. So I think I've explained everything. What is happening over here. Behind the scenes, Create React app is actually using Webpack to start your development server so that you can work on it. And whenever you want to stop your development server, you can just hit Control-C and it's gone. Again, you want to start it, just do yarn start, and it's going to start it again. Okay, and it also tells you where it's running. So you have to copy this URL and you have to paste it here like so to know that it's running there. All right, so I hope you did like it. Yeah, so now you have a solid understanding of what React is, how it works, what it is, why it's used, why it's benefit, why people are using it, who's created it. Whole Facebook is built in React, right?